A woman accepts a dream job at the mansion of a millionaire couple, believing she has found her financial salvation. But everything changes when she goes up to the attic and finds her employer's son chained in the dim light. Shock gives way to fear, and fear to doubt, when she discovers that nothing there is as it seems, because the truth behind that chain reveals not cruelty, but the kind of love that destroys the one who feels it. The morning sun timidly illuminated the windows of North Central Bronx Hospital. On the outskirts of the Bronx, New York, as Irene Thompson, 42, held tightly to the hand of her mother, Zelda, the deep, dark circles under the daughter's eyes revealed sleepless nights and a growing concern over the treatment that was becoming more expensive by the day. "Mom, you're going to get better. I'll figure something out," Irene whispered, swallowing the lump in her throat as she saw the medications not covered by Medicaid listed on the prescription. The weekly cost was almost equivalent to what she earned doing odd cleaning jobs in the area. That Tuesday morning, after leaving Zelda in the care of her younger sister, Irene headed to Midtown Manhattan. The crowded bus and the August heat made the journey even more exhausting. In her time-worn bag, she carried newspaper clippings with job ads and a small notebook, where she jotted down agency addresses. At the third agency of the day, located near Fifth Avenue, the receptionist barely looked up to acknowledge her. Irene was used to this treatment, but she couldn't afford to give up. "We have an opening for a cleaner in Scarsdale, but the job starts tomorrow," the woman said with indifference. "It's for a demanding family. They pay well, but they've gone through 3 housekeepers in 2 months. Irene felt a knot in her stomach. Scarsdale was far away. It would mean waking up even earlier, taking more buses and trains. But the amount the receptionist mentioned made her eyes widen. It was more than double what she could make with freelance cleaning. "I'll take it," she replied without hesitation. "What's the address?" The next day, after a journey of nearly 2 hours, Irene arrived at the Sunstone Estates, one of the most exclusive gated communities in Scarsdale. At the security gate, she had to leave her ID and was escorted by a guard to house number 227, a 3-story mansion with impeccably manicured gardens. Standing before the imposing gate, she felt small, out of place. Her simple uniform contrasted with the grandeur of the place. She took a deep breath, adjusted her hair, which was tied in a low bun, and pressed the intercom. "Good morning, I'm Irene Thompson, the new cleaner." After a few seconds of silence, an electronic click released the gate. Irene walked through the garden, observing the sculptures and the glistening pool that reflected the blue morning sky. The main door opened before she could even ring the bell. "Come in," said a tall woman about 50 years old, with perfectly dyed brown hair and clothes that bespoke her high social standing. Despite her flawless appearance, there was something in her eyes, a weariness, a sadness that expensive makeup couldn't hide. "I'm Marianne Harrington. My husband Arthur is away on business." Irene followed Marianne through the mansion's interior, trying not to show her astonishment at the luxury surrounding her. Designer furniture, original works of art, a kitchen that looked like it was straight out of a design magazine. The woman explained the house rules in a monotone voice, as if reciting a memorized script. "The second floor has 4 suites. They all need to be cleaned daily. My husband's office is off limits. You only go in when he is present. The third floor," she paused almost imperceptibly, "is under renovation. You don't need to go up there." Irene nodded, memorizing each instruction while discreetly analyzing Marianne's expression. There was something odd about her demeanor, a constant tension, as if she were always on high alert. "There's one more thing," Marianne added, handing her a key ring with several keys identified by colored tags. "You must always leave before 7 in the evening. No exceptions." In the days that followed, Irene established a routine. She left home while it was still dark, took 2 buses to Scarsdale, and arrived punctually at 7 in the morning at the Harrington mansion. Marianne was usually already out for appointments, leaving notes with specific instructions on what needed to be done that day. The work was exhausting, but the pay made up for it. After just 1 week, Irene was able to buy her mother's missing medications and even hire a caregiver to stay with Zelda during the day. It was on the 6th day that Irene noticed something she hadn't before. While cleaning the second-floor hallway, she heard a faint sound coming from above. She stopped, straining her ears. It sounded like a chair creaking, followed by the sound of footsteps. "It must be my imagination," she murmured to herself, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had taken hold. Marianne had said the third floor was under renovation and no one was working there. But in all those days she hadn't seen any workers, heard any construction noise, or noticed any building materials being brought in. That night, upon arriving home, Irene couldn't stop thinking about the sounds she had heard. Her mind spun theories, some absurd, others disturbing. Maybe it was just the old house making its characteristic noises. Or maybe— "Stop it," she chided herself while preparing tea for her mother. "You need this job." The next day, Irene arrived determined to focus only on her tasks. To her surprise, she found Arthur Harrington having coffee in the kitchen. It was the first time she had seen him in person, although Marianne had mentioned he would be back from his trip. Tall, with an elegant posture and greying hair at the temples that gave him a distinguished air, Arthur had the weary look of someone who hadn't slept well in a long time. "Good morning," he greeted her with forced politeness. "You must be Irene. Marianne spoke highly of your work." "Thank you, sir. I do my best." Arthur nodded, took the last sip of his coffee, and stood up to leave. Before leaving the kitchen, he turned to her with an expression Irene couldn't decipher. "Marianne asked you to clean all the suites today. She had to leave early for a doctor's appointment." Irene spent the morning meticulously cleaning each of the suites. 3 of them seemed rarely used, with perfectly made beds and no personal items in sight. Only the master suite showed clear signs of occupation, with clothes in the closet and toiletries in the bathroom. While changing the towels in the master bathroom, Irene noticed a door that seemed out of place with the sophisticated decor of the rest of the house. It was a simple wooden door with an old-fashioned lock. Curious, she tried to open it, but it was locked. After finishing the second floor, Irene went down to prepare her lunch in the staff kitchen. That's when she noticed an envelope on the table with her name on it. Inside there was a handwritten note in an elegant script. "Irene, I will need you to clean the attic today. Please use only the lantern from the cleaning supply closet, as the electricity up there is not working. The golden key on your key ring opens the door at the end of the third-floor hallway. Please be discreet and do not mention this task to anyone. There will be a bonus in your pay, Marianne." With the note in her hand, Irene felt a shiver run down her spine. She would finally have access to the mysterious third floor. Part of her wanted to ignore the request, say she didn't have time, make up an excuse. But the mention of a bonus brought her thoughts back to her mother's medicine, to the mounting bills. After lunch, Irene took the indicated lantern and climbed the stairs to the third floor. The hallway was narrow, with old faded wallpaper, completely different from the impeccably decorated rest of the house. At the end of the hall, she found the door mentioned in the note. With trembling hands, she inserted the golden key into the lock. The mechanism turned with difficulty, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. When the door finally opened, Irene lit the lantern and stepped inside the room. What she saw next would be etched in her memory forever. The attic was a large space with a sloping ceiling and a single circular window covered by a heavy curtain that blocked almost all outside light. The lantern's weak glow revealed what looked like a makeshift bedroom, a simple bed, a dresser, a chair, and next to the window, a desk with stacked books and notebooks. But what made Irene's heart nearly stop was the figure sitting on the edge of the bed. A young man of about 17, extremely thin, with skin so pale it seemed he hadn't seen the sun in a long time. His ankles were bound by padded straps fixed to the bed frame, allowing him to move only within a limited radius. The young man looked up as the lantern's light illuminated his face. His eyes, a deep brown, seemed empty, lifeless. He showed no surprise, fear, or any other emotion upon seeing Irene. He just watched her, as if she were just another object in that oppressive environment. Irene felt her blood run cold. Her first instinct was to run, to scream, to call the police. But something in the young man's vacant expression paralyzed her. He didn't seem threatening, he seemed broken. "Hello," she murmured, her voice trembling uncontrollably. The young man didn't respond, continuing to look at her with that absent expression. Backing away slowly, Irene left the attic and closed the door, turning the key in the lock with shaky fingers. She ran down the stairs, nearly tripping her heart, pounding so hard it felt like it would leap out of her chest. In the kitchen, she leaned against the sink, breathing heavily as she tried to process what she had just seen. A teenager imprisoned, hidden in the mansion's attic. What kind of people were the Harringtons? Kidnappers? Abusers? Her mind raced with possibilities, each more terrible than the last. Irene couldn't finish her tasks that day. Her hands trembled so much that she dropped a porcelain vase while trying to dust the objects in the living room. The shards scattered on the floor were like fragments of her peace of mind, now shattered by the discovery in the attic. When the clock struck 6:30, she hurried to leave, wanting only to get away from that mansion and the dark secret it held. At the bus stop, her cell phone rang. It was Marianne. "Irene, did you clean the attic?" as I asked. Her employer's voice sounded tense, almost feverish. "Yes, ma'am," she answered automatically, while her mind screamed at her to hang up, to run. An audible sigh came from the other end of the line. "I need you to come in earlier tomorrow. At 6, we have something important to discuss." Before she could reply, Marianne hung up. Irene stood frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear, as the bus that would take her home passed by without her signaling it. The night was torturous. Lying next to her mother, who was sleeping under the effect of her medication, Irene stared at the peeling ceiling of her small apartment, mentally reviewing her options. She could report the couple, but what if she was misinterpreting the situation? It would be her word against that of two influential people. She could simply not go back. But what about the money for her mother's treatment? Every alternative seemed to lead to a dead end. When the alarm clock rang at 4 in the morning, Irene was already awake. She got ready mechanically, left food prepared for Zelda, and went out to face whatever awaited her. Upon arriving at the mansion, still under the faint light of dawn, she found Marianne at the door. The woman was visibly distraught, her eyes swollen from a night of crying. "Come in," she said, her voice hoarse. "Arthur is in the living room." Irene followed Marianne to the main living room, where Arthur Harrington was sitting in an armchair, his head bowed, his hands clasped as if in prayer. When he looked up, Irene saw the same emptiness she had noticed in the eyes of the young man in the attic. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to the sofa in front of him. "We know you saw our Gabriel." Gabriel. The young man had a name. Somehow that made it all the more real, more painful. Irene sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa, ready to stand up and run if necessary. "Before you jump to conclusions," Arthur continued, his voice choked with emotion, "we would like you to know everything. Afterward you can decide what to do." Marianne sat beside her husband, holding his hand tightly. It was she who began to tell the story. "Gabriel is our only son. Since he was little, he was a bright, sensitive child, full of life. At 15, he started to change. At first, we thought it was just adolescence, you know. That difficult phase everyone goes through." Arthur continued, his voice low, almost a whisper. "But we soon realized it was something more serious. He started hearing voices, having delusions, violent episodes. One day he would be fine, the next unrecognizable. We took him to every specialist you can imagine." Marianne stood up abruptly, went to a bookshelf and returned with a cardboard box. She opened it and began to take out documents one after another, spreading them on the coffee table. "Here are all the diagnoses: paranoid schizophrenia, severe dissociation, bipolar disorder with psychotic features. Each doctor said something different, but they all agreed it was serious. Very serious." Irene looked at the papers, recognizing stamps from renowned hospitals, international clinics, prescriptions with names of drugs she could never pronounce. "For 2 years," Arthur continued, "we tried all the conventional treatments. Hospitalizations, medications, therapies. We spent a fortune on specialized clinics, both here and abroad. Nothing worked for long." Marianne took a photo album from the bottom of the box. She showed Irene pictures of a different Gabriel, a smiling teenager with bright eyes, playing tennis, playing the guitar, hugging his parents on idyllic beaches. The contrast with the pale, apathetic young man from the attic was devastating. 6 months ago," Marianne took a deep breath, as if each word cost immense effort. "During a particularly violent episode, Gabriel tried to take his own life. It was the 4th attempt, but this time, he almost succeeded." Tears now streamed freely down Marianne's face. Arthur put his arm around his wife's shoulders, pulling her close. "The psychiatric hospitals refused to keep him indefinitely. The specialized clinics charged fortunes, but couldn't guarantee total safety. He had already escaped from 2 institutions during psychotic episodes, putting himself in danger on the streets. Irene felt a lump in her throat. The image she had been building of this family was beginning to change. You keep him locked up there?" she finally managed to ask, her voice barely audible. "Not locked up," Arthur corrected, rubbing his tired face. "Protected. The restraints on his ankles are only to prevent him from hurting himself during his episodes. A private doctor, Dr. Clark, comes weekly to adjust his medication and check his physical condition. Why not tell anyone? Why hide him?" Marianne wiped her tears with the back of her hand, smudging her expensive makeup. "Because we were afraid the authorities would take him, put him in some precarious public institution, or worse, leave him without proper care. You know what the public mental health system in our country is like, don't you? It's inhumane." Irene knew. Her own older sister, Judith, had battled depression for years. She remembered the endless lines to get an appointment, the frequent medication shortages, the overworked professionals who barely had time to listen to patients. "Why did you show me this? Why did you tell me?" she asked, still trying to process it all. Arthur and Marianne exchanged a long look, as if communicating silently. "Because we're at our breaking point," Arthur finally admitted. We don't know what to do anymore. We're isolated, exhausted, desperate. And you were the first person who seemed trustworthy." Marianne nodded. "We've watched how you treat our home, how you speak respectfully of your mother, how hard you work. We needed someone who could help us, not judge us." "Help how?" "Gabriel needs companionship, stimulation. We try, but it's painful to see him like this day after day. We've noticed that the more time he spends in isolation, the worse he gets. We need someone who can be with him when we can't, who can read to him, talk to him, even if he doesn't respond." Irene felt the weight of that request. It wasn't just about cleaning an attic. It was about entering a world of suffering that wasn't her own. "If you decide to report us," Arthur said with a resigned voice, "we will understand. We only ask that you give us a few days to find an alternative for Gabriel. We don't want him to suffer even more." Marianne took an envelope from the box and handed it to Irene. "Here is this month's pay, plus the bonus I promised. If you want to leave now, you are free to do so. We won't stop you." Irene looked at the envelope in her hands. It represented the ability to continue her mother's treatment, to have some financial stability. But now there was more at stake than just money. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course," Arthur replied. "Take the day off. Come back tomorrow if you decide to stay with us." On the way back home, Irene tried to organize her thoughts. The Harrington story seemed genuine. The pain in their eyes was real, the documents looked authentic, the desperation palpable. But to keep their own son isolated, tied to a bed, it was hard to justify, no matter the intention. When she got home, she found Zelda sitting on the small apartment balcony, sunbathing as the doctor had recommended. "You're back early." "Dear," the old woman observed with a faint smile. The illness had consumed her vitality, but not her observant spirit. "Did something happen?" Irene sat beside her mother, trying to decide how much she could share. "It's complicated, Mum. I discovered something at work that has left me confused." "What kind of thing?" "A situation where people are doing something that seems wrong, but for reasons they believe are right." Zelda was silent for a moment, her wise eyes studying her daughter's face. "Do you remember your Uncle Silas? Your father's brother?" Irene nodded. Silas had been a kind man who always brought candy when he visited. But he had disappeared when she was a teenager, and the subject was rarely mentioned. "He had schizophrenia," Zelda revealed. "Back then, we didn't have a fancy name for it. They just said he had head problems. Your father and I tried to take care of him after your grandmother passed, but it was hard." Irene's eyes widened, surprised by the revelation. "What happened to him?" "One day, during an episode, he left the house without us noticing. He was found 3 days later, dehydrated, injured. He was never the same. The system swallowed him up, dear. He went through horrible institutions, inhumane treatments. When we finally managed to bring him back home, he was just a shadow of the man we knew." Zelda's words painfully echoed the concerns of Arthur and Marianne. "I'm not saying I know what's right or wrong in your situation," the old woman continued, holding her daughter's hand. "Just that sometimes what looks like care to some can look like cruelty to others. And the official path isn't always the best one. That night Irene couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in bed, thinking of young Gabriel, of the empty eyes that seemed to be pleading for help without words. She thought of her employers, of the evident desperation in their voices, the exhaustion etched on their faces. And she thought of the uncle she never really knew, destroyed by a system that should have protected him. When the sun rose, her decision was made. She would return to the mansion, not to report or condemn, but to understand better, to see if there was a way to help not just Gabriel, but that entire family, fractured by illness and isolation. She arrived at the Harrington mansion shortly after 7 in the morning. Marianne answered the door, her face marked by the tension of waiting. "You came back," she said with a mix of relief and apprehension. "I came back," Irene confirmed. "I want to understand the situation better before I judge. And, if possible, I want to speak with the doctor who sees Gabriel." The relief on Marianne's face was almost painful to witness. "Dr. Clark is coming this afternoon. I'll let him know you'll be here." That morning passed at a different pace for Irene. Her domestic tasks remained the same, but now every corner of the mansion revealed a new perspective. The empty spaces, the absence of recent photographs, the rarely used rooms, everything told the story of a family that had withdrawn, like a wounded animal hiding to lick its wounds. During lunch, sitting alone in the staff kitchen, Irene heard footsteps and looked up to find Arthur standing uncertainly in the doorway. "May I join you?" he asked, indicating the empty chair across the table. Irene nodded, surprised by the gesture. In her previous experiences as a housekeeper, employers rarely shared spaces with staff. Arthur sat down, placing a folder on the table. "I wanted to show you something before Dr. Clark arrives." From the folder, he took out photographs, hospital receipts, medical records. One by one, he explained the journey they had taken over the past few years. Gabriel's first hospitalization at 15, after an episode where he broke every mirror in the house, cutting himself badly. The attempts with different medications, some that left him completely apathetic, others that simply didn't work. The stays in psychiatric clinics in the US, then abroad, Argentina, Switzerland. "This was our last resort," Arthur said, showing a photograph of a luxurious clinic near Zurich. "It cost the equivalent of a mid-sized apartment in New York City. Per month." Irene absorbed every piece of information, every image, trying to comprehend the depth of the family's desperation. "Why did you come back, if there was treatment there?" Arthur closed his eyes for a moment, as if the memory was too painful to revisit. In the 3rd week, Gabriel had an episode so violent that he severely injured another patient. The clinic asked us to remove him, saying they weren't equipped for such extreme cases. It was a lie, of course. They were just protecting their reputation as a quiet place for the wealthy with manageable problems. He put the documents away slowly, with the care of someone handling fragile relics. "Do you know what's most painful, Irene? Seeing your child, the baby you rocked to sleep, the child you taught to ride a bike, transform into someone you don't recognize. And knowing that somewhere inside that body, your son still exists, imprisoned by his own mind." Irene felt a lump in her throat. "Can I ask something? Something I didn't understand?" "Of course. Why the attic? Why not one of the bedrooms on the 2nd floor?" Arthur sighed deeply. At first, Gabriel stayed in his regular room, but during an episode, he tried to jump out the window. That's why we adapted the attic. Fewer external stimuli, no easy access to windows, more controllable. It's not ideal, we know that. It's a solution born of desperation. The sound of the doorbell interrupted their conversation. Arthur stood up, collecting the folder. "That must be Dr. Clark. Come, let's go to the living room." Dr. Henry Clark was not what Irene had expected. Instead of the elderly authoritarian doctor she had imagined, she found a man of about 40, with curly hair graying at the temples and kind eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses. He was dressed simply, jeans, a dress shirt, well-worn shoes. "So you're Irene," he said, extending his hand in greeting. "Marianne told me about you. It's good to have someone new on the team." "I don't know if I'm part of the team," she replied hesitantly. "I'm still trying to understand the situation." The doctor smiled understandingly. "Fair enough. Shall we talk after I've examined Gabriel?" For the next hour, Irene remained in the living room while Dr. Clark went upstairs with the Harringtons to assess Gabriel. She used the time to reflect on everything she had learned. She was beginning to understand that the situation was infinitely more complex than she had initially imagined. When the doctor finally came down, alone he found Irene still sitting in the same spot, lost in thought. "The Harringtons will be up there for a while," he explained, sitting in the armchair opposite her, trying to establish some contact with Gabriel. "They rarely succeed, but they never give up." "How is he?" Irene asked. "Stable. Not better, not worse. Physically, he's well cared for. Hydrated, nourished, no bed sores or signs of mistreatment. Mentally, he remains profoundly disconnected from reality." "Doctor, what they're doing, is it legal?" Henry took off his glasses, rubbing his tired eyes. "Legal? Definitely not. Ethical? That's a much harder question to answer." He put his glasses back on, looking directly at Irene. "What I see is a family that tried all the conventional paths and was rejected by a system that isn't prepared for cases like Gabriel's. I've seen the records. I've followed the last few months. Believe me, they tried to do everything right. But keeping their own son restrained? The ankle restraints are for protection, not punishment," the doctor explained. "I've seen Gabriel during his episodes. He bangs his head against the wall, tries to tear off his own skin, bites himself until he bleeds. The alternatives would be to keep him permanently sedated or in a straitjacket." Irene shivered at the description. "I'm not saying their solution is ideal," Henry continued. "It's an arrangement born of desperation and exhaustion. But I can assure you there is no malice here, only parents terrified of losing their son to suicide or to a system that would treat him even worse." "And are there no other options?" "None at all?" The doctor hesitated as if weighing his words. "There are some experimental programs, research with new treatment protocols, but they are few with limited spots, usually linked to universities. I even tried to refer Gabriel to one of these programs, but the waiting list is immense." "What about private hospitals? They have money." "Private psychiatric hospitals in the US are mostly luxury hotels for stable patients. Complex cases like Gabriel's are frightening. They represent risks. No one wants to take on the responsibility." Henry leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Do you know what the biggest problem with our mental health system is, Irene? It's not a lack of resources, though that's also true. It's the lack of structural compassion, the inability to deal with cases that fall outside the norm, that require more than pre-established protocols." Those words resonated deeply with Irene, reminding her of her own struggle to get proper treatment for her mother. "What do you think should happen now?" she asked, seeking some direction. "If you report the situation, Gabriel will likely be removed to a public institution. On paper, that seems correct. In practice, I have serious doubts he would receive better care than he's getting here." Henry stood up, picking up his medical bag. "I'm not going to tell you what to do, Irene. That decision must come from you, based on your own values and judgment. I only ask that, whatever your choice, you consider Gabriel's well-being above all else." Before leaving, he handed her a card. "This is my personal number. If you decide to stay and help, or if you decide to seek other solutions, you can call me anytime." After the doctor left, Irene remained in the living room, the card between her fingers, thinking about the implications of each possible path. The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced Marianne's return. She was alone, her face marked by fresh tears. "Arthur is with Gabriel," she explained, sitting heavily on the sofa. "Those are the most precious moments of his day, even if Gabriel rarely responds." A heavy silence settled between the two women, each lost in her own thoughts. "Can I see Gabriel again?" Irene finally asked. "Not hidden, not as an intruder. I want to really meet him." Marianne seemed surprised by the request, but nodded. "Of course, shall we go now?" Going up to the attic voluntarily was very different from the previous day's experience. This time there was no element of surprise or terror. There was, however, a weight in Irene's heart, a mix of apprehension and compassion. When they entered the room, Arthur was sitting beside Gabriel's bed, reading aloud from a book Irene recognized as The Little Prince. The young man was lying down, staring at the ceiling, seemingly oblivious to his father's presence or the story's words. Arthur stopped reading when he saw the two women. His eyes met Irene's, questioning. "She wanted to see Gabriel," Marianne explained. "To really meet him." Arthur nodded, standing up to give her his seat. "Maybe a different voice." "Who knows?" Irene approached hesitantly, sitting in the chair Arthur had just left. Up close, she could see the young man's details better, the dark hair that needed a cut, the brown eyes that seemed fixed on something only he could see, the long, thin fingers resting motionless on the blanket. "Hello." "Gabriel," she said, her voice soft. "My name is Irene. I work for your parents." No response, no reaction. It was like talking to a photograph. "Your father was reading to you," she continued, picking up the abandoned book. "May I continue?" Without waiting for an answer, Irene opened the book where Arthur had left off and began to read. Her voice, initially shaky with tension, gained confidence as the words flowed. It was during the third paragraph that it happened, so subtle it almost went unnoticed. Gabriel's eyes, previously fixed on the ceiling, moved slowly until they met Irene's face. For a fleeting instant, there seemed to be a flicker of consciousness in his gaze, like a distant light seen through a dense fog. Marianne, who was watching closely, held her breath. Arthur, standing at the door, took an involuntary step forward. The moment lasted only seconds. Soon Gabriel's eyes lost their focus again, returning to their usual emptiness. But that brief instant of connection was enough to change something inside Irene. She continued reading, page after page, until her voice began to fail. When she finally stopped, she realized almost an hour had passed. "He looked at you," Marianne whispered as they went back down to the second floor. "It has been weeks since he's shown any recognition of his surroundings." "It might not mean anything," Arthur cautioned, trying to contain his own excitement. "We've seen small signs before that didn't lead to lasting improvement." But there was a spark of hope in his eyes that contradicted his cautious words. "Can I come again tomorrow?" Irene asked. "To read a little more." The couple exchanged surprised glances. You mean you're going to stay with us?" Marianne asked, almost in disbelief. Irene took a deep breath. "I will, for now, but on one condition." "Anything," Arthur replied quickly. "We need to look for alternatives. I can't accept this situation continuing indefinitely. Gabriel deserves more than an attic, however well-intentioned you are." The relief on the Harringtons' faces was palpable, mixed with an understandable apprehension of the unknown. "What do you suggest?" Marianne asked. "I don't know yet. I need to do some research, talk to people, understand the options better. Dr. Clark mentioned experimental programs, university research. Maybe there are paths you haven't explored yet." Arthur nodded slowly. "That's fair. In fact, I think we needed an outsider to give us that perspective. When you're in the middle of the hurricane, it's hard to see beyond the immediate storm." On the way home that night, Irene felt simultaneously lighter and heavier. She had made a decision that would change not only her life, but potentially the lives of that entire family. It was an immense weight to carry, but also an opportunity to make a difference in a way she had never imagined. When she got home, she found her younger sister, Claire, taking care of Zelda. "How is she?" she asked, kissing her sleeping mother's forehead. "Better today," Claire answered. "The new meds seem to be working, and you? You look tired." Irene gave a weak smile. "It was an intense day." "Claire, do you remember what happened with Uncle Silas? Details that Mom might not have mentioned?" Claire's expression turned somber. "Why do you want to know about that now?" "It's hard to explain. I need to better understand how the system works for people with severe mental illness." Claire gestured to the small balcony. Outside, under the starry New York sky, partially obscured by light pollution, she lit a cigarette. It wasn't just the institutions that destroyed Uncle Silas. Although they contributed a lot, she began, her voice low so as not to disturb their mother sleeping inside. It was the social isolation, the stigma. People treated our family like schizophrenia was contagious. Neighbors would cross the street to avoid us. Dad lost friendships that were decades old. Irene absorbed every word, drawing connections to the Harringtons' situation. "I think what really broke Silas was realizing he had become a burden to the family, that his existence had turned us all into outcasts. He withdrew more and more until one day, during a moment of lucidity, he ran away. I think in his own way he was trying to set us free." Claire stubbed out her cigarette with excessive force on the balcony railing. "The system didn't just fail him. It failed the whole family. There was no support, no understanding, no alternatives. And from what I see in the hospitals where I work as a nursing assistant, not much has changed since then." The following weeks established a new routine in Irene's life. She arrived at the Harrington mansion earlier, performed her domestic duties efficiently, and dedicated at least 2 hours of her day to being with Gabriel. She started by reading books, then tried playing music on an old radio she found in the pantry. Sometimes she simply talked, telling him about her life, her mother, the small adventures of her day. Gabriel rarely responded. The brief moments of connection, a glance, a subtle movement of his fingers, a nearly imperceptible change in his breathing, were like precious gems found in a vast desert. Irene learned to value each one, not to expect major breakthroughs, to celebrate the smallest victories. Meanwhile, she kept her promise to seek alternatives. On weekends, she visited public libraries to research schizophrenia and innovative treatments. She discreetly talked with her sister Claire about procedures in the hospitals where she worked. In one of these conversations, Claire mentioned something that immediately caught her attention. "There's a doctor at Columbia University Medical Center," Claire commented as they prepared dinner together. "Dr. Paul Richards. He runs a research program on treatment-resistant cases of schizophrenia. Everyone talks about him, says he gets results where others give up." That piece of information was like a small seed planted in Irene's mind. The next day, after finishing her tasks at the mansion and spending her usual time with Gabriel, she approached Marianne in the kitchen. "Have you ever heard of a Dr. Paul Richards?" Marianne frowned, thoughtful. "The name sounds familiar. I think he was mentioned by one of the doctors we consulted early on, but we didn't follow up on that referral. Why?" "My sister is a nursing assistant, and she mentioned a program he runs, specifically for resistant cases like Gabriel's." A flicker of hope briefly lit up Marianne's tired eyes, only to be replaced by the caution of someone who had been disappointed many times before. "Irene, you can't imagine how many specialists, therapies and experimental programs we've tried. Each new treatment came with great promises and ended in failure. You reach a point where you can't take the emotional roller coaster anymore." "I understand," Irene replied softly. "But maybe this one is different." "Why would it be?" "Because now you have me." The simplicity and conviction of that statement surprised both women. Irene hadn't planned to say it. The words just sprang from somewhere deep inside her. "What do you mean?" Marianne asked, her voice choked with emotion. "I mean, you're not alone in this fight anymore. I know it's not much, that I'm just an employee, but I'm willing to help, to be part of the solution." Marianne, usually so composed, covered her face with her hands and began to cry silently. These were different tears, not of despair but of a relief so profound it bordered on pain. "You don't understand what it means. To have someone who doesn't judge, who isn't afraid, who doesn't look at Gabriel as if he were a monster," she said between sobs. That night at dinner, Marianne shared the conversation with Arthur. He listened in silence, his fork frozen mid-air, his gaze distant. "We can at least look into it," Marianne suggested, gently touching her husband's hand. "We don't have to commit right away." "What if it's just another disappointment?" he asked, his voice heavy with emotional fatigue. "And what if it's not?" The next day, Irene arrived at the mansion to find Arthur in his office on the phone, trying to schedule an appointment with Dr. Paul Richards. From his frustrated expression, he wasn't having any luck. "They understand it's urgent, but his schedule is booked for the next 4 months, he explained, hanging up. "Apparently, we're not the only ones desperate for this doctor." Irene bit her lip, thinking. "What if we go in person? Sometimes face-to-face. Doors open more easily." And so 3 days later, Irene found herself in the lobby of Columbia University Medical Center alongside Arthur, waiting patiently for the moment Dr. Richards would finish his rounds so they could approach him. A strategy suggested by Claire, who knew the doctor's routines. Dr. Paul Richards did not match the mental image Irene had created. He was a man of medium height, black with closely cropped grey hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore an impeccably white coat over simple clothes and carried a leather briefcase worn with use. What was most striking, however, were his eyes, intense, observant, but extraordinarily kind. When they finally managed to approach him in the hallway, Irene let Arthur take the lead. "Dr. Paul Richards? My name is Arthur Harrington. This is Irene Thompson. We'd like a few minutes of your time to discuss a complex case." The doctor examined them briefly, as if assessing not just their words but their deepest intentions. "My office, 5 minutes," he replied succinctly, before continuing on his way. Dr. Richards's small office was surprisingly cozy, with walls covered in books, a few plants, and curiously, several pieces of art that Irene recognized as being created by psychiatric patients. "So, who is the patient?" he asked directly after closing the door. Arthur hesitated for a moment before answering. "My son, Gabriel, 17 years old, primary diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia with severe psychotic episodes, resistant to all conventional medications we've tried." Dr. Richards nodded, as if he had expected something along those lines. "And where is he currently being treated?" The silence that followed was heavy, laden with implications. The doctor's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mr. Harrington, my time is precious and limited. If you want my help, I need the whole truth." It was Irene who answered, surprising herself. "He's being cared for at home, in the attic, with restraints on his ankles to prevent self-harm during his episodes." Arthur shot her an alarmed look, but she continued. "His parents tried every conventional treatment for 2 years. They spent a fortune on specialized clinics here and abroad. Nothing worked for long. After multiple suicide attempts and escapes from institutions, they made this extreme decision. A doctor, Dr. Clark, visits him weekly. He's physically well cared for, but increasingly disconnected from reality." Dr. Richards looked at Irene for a long moment, then at Arthur. "And you are?" "I work as a cleaner in the family's home. I discovered Gabriel by accident a few weeks ago. Since then, I've been spending time with him daily." The doctor leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "Mr. Harrington, what Ms. Thompson has described constitutes false imprisonment, even with good intentions. I am legally obligated to report this to the authorities." Arthur turned pale but maintained his composure. "I understand, and I will accept the consequences. But before you do that, I ask you to consider what will happen to Gabriel if he is abruptly removed to a public institution. He has already been through dozens of doctors, hundreds of evaluations. Every change destabilizes him further. What exactly do you expect from me?" the doctor asked, his expression unreadable. "For you to see Gabriel, to tell us if there's hope, if your program could help him. We are willing to do anything. Sell the house, move to another city, whatever it takes. We just want a real chance for our son." Dr. Richards was silent for long moments, as if fighting an internal battle. Finally, he took a planner from his drawer. "Tomorrow at 6 p.m. I will make a house call. I promise nothing more than an honest assessment. Depending on what I find, I will take the measures I deem necessary for the patient's well-being. This may include reporting you to the authorities. Are you aware of this?" Arthur nodded gravely. "We are. Thank you, Doctor." On the way back, Arthur drove in silence, his knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. It was only when they stopped at a red light that he finally spoke. "Why did you tell him everything?" "He could have reported us immediately." Irene looked out the window, watching the city pass by. "Because he wouldn't help us based on lies. And because if he's really as good as they say, he would have already sensed we were hiding something." "You trust him?" "I trust his eyes," she replied simply. "They reminded me of my father's, eyes that see beyond appearances." The mansion felt different when they arrived, quieter, as if it too were waiting, holding its breath before a decisive moment. Marianne received the news of Dr. Richards's impending visit with a mixture of hope and terror. She spent the rest of the day in a flurry of activity, organizing medical documents, personally cleaning Gabriel's room, choosing what clothes her son would wear. "Marianne," Irene called gently, seeing her employer compulsively scrubbing a non-existent stain on the attic floor. "It's not the appearance of the house that will matter to Dr. Richards. It's Gabriel." The woman stopped, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I know, but I have to do something or I'll go crazy with anxiety." That night, Irene didn't go home. She called Claire, asking her to stay with their mother, and settled into the mansion's guest room. She felt she needed to be present when the doctor arrived, not just as a witness, but as a bridge between worlds, the Harringtons' world and the world of institutional medicine that had so disappointed them. Dr. Richards arrived promptly at 6 p.m. the next day. He politely declined the offer of coffee or water, asking to see the patient immediately. He walked up the stairs with firm steps, followed by a silent procession of Arthur, Marianne, and Irene. In the attic, Gabriel was sitting on the bed, looking out the small circular window. The sunset cast golden patterns on his pale face, giving him an almost ethereal appearance. Unlike usual, he seemed uncommonly alert, though he still showed no recognition when they entered. Dr. Richards approached slowly, placing his medical bag on the floor. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he sat in the chair beside the bed at Gabriel's eye level and simply waited. Minutes passed in complete silence. Marianne began to fidget, but Arthur held her arm firmly, signaling for patience with a look. Finally, the doctor spoke, his voice calm and melodic. "Hello, Gabriel. My name is Paul. I'm not your enemy. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to listen." Gabriel didn't respond, but something subtle changed in his posture, an almost imperceptible tilt of his head in the doctor's direction. Dr. Richards continued speaking, a quiet monologue that alternated between simple questions, observations about the weather, and comments on the view from the window. His voice maintained a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Gradually, he introduced more complex questions, though without really expecting answers. At one point, he mentioned music. "Your parents told me you played the guitar. What was your favorite band?" To the shock of everyone present, Gabriel moved his fingers slightly as if strumming invisible strings. The doctor showed no surprise, continuing the conversation naturally. "Classical, or something more contemporary?" Gabriel's fingers stopped and his mouth moved almost imperceptibly. No one could hear if any sound was made. Dr. Richards moved a little closer. "Can you repeat that, Gabriel?" "I'm listening." This time a nearly inaudible whisper escaped. "The Smiths." Marianne stifled a sob, covering her mouth with her hand. It was the first word they had heard from Gabriel in almost 3 weeks. The rest of the examination proceeded in an almost magical atmosphere. Dr. Richards didn't get any more verbal responses, but he elicited small non-verbal reactions, a nod, an eye movement, a change in breathing. He checked vital signs, examined the ankle restraints, which he immediately asked to be loosened, observed his pupils and tested his reflexes. After nearly 2 hours, he asked to speak with the adults privately downstairs. In the living room, they all sat in tense silence awaiting the verdict. The doctor organized his notes methodically before speaking. "Gabriel is physically well cared for, considering the circumstances. I see no signs of intentional mistreatment. However, the current situation is unsustainable and legally indefensible." Arthur and Marianne squeezed each other's hands tightly. "That said," the doctor continued, "I do not believe that reporting this to the authorities and the subsequent abrupt removal to an institution would be in the patient's best interest at this time." A collective sigh of relief filled the room. "What do you suggest then, Doctor?" Arthur asked, his voice trembling. Dr. Richards opened his briefcase and took out some forms, placing them on the coffee table. "I run a research program at Columbia University Medical Center, focused specifically on treatment-resistant cases of schizophrenia. It's a collaborative project between Columbia and international universities, with innovative protocols that combine new medication approaches, intensive therapies, and structured family support." He paused, looking directly at Arthur and Marianne. "I'm not offering miracle cures. Resistant schizophrenia is one of the most challenging conditions in modern psychiatry. But I do offer a different approach, one that treats the patient as a whole person, not just a set of symptoms to be suppressed." "Would Gabriel be accepted into this program?" Marianne asked, renewed hope in her voice. Dr. Richards hesitated briefly. "Normally there's a long waiting list. Resources are limited, spots are scarce. But Gabriel's case presents features that make it particularly relevant to our current research." "What features?" Arthur leaned forward, interested. "The age of onset, the resistance to multiple conventional treatments, the periods of responsiveness alternating with profound dissociation. Also, the fact that he still shows a connection to music suggests that certain neurological pathways remain intact." Irene, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "What would happen in practice, Doctor? What would the treatment be like?" "Gabriel would need to be transferred to our specialized unit. Initially, he would be hospitalized for stabilization and intensive evaluation. advanced neurological scans, careful medication adjustments, structured therapies. This phase usually lasts 4 to 6 weeks. The doctor turned a page in his notes. Then, depending on his progress, we would move to a semi-intensive regimen. He could return home at night, but would spend the day at the treatment center. Eventually, we would transition to regular outpatient appointments, combined with specific therapies. Marianne and Arthur exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. How much would it cost? Arthur asked directly. Not that money is an issue, but we need to be prepared. Dr. Richards smiled faintly. It's a research program funded by public and private institutions. There are no direct costs for selected patients, other than transportation and any very specific medications not covered by the public health system. The surprise was evident on the couple's faces. It sounds too good to be true, Marianne commented cautiously. Why have we never heard of this program before? Because it's relatively new and extremely selective. We don't advertise widely precisely to avoid creating false hope for the thousands of families facing situations similar to yours. Arthur frowned thoughtfully. And what about the legal aspects of the current situation? You mentioned it's unsustainable and indefensible. Dr. Richards removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose wearily. Officially, I cannot ignore the fact that you are keeping a minor in conditions of confinement without legal authorization. However, I also recognize the complexity of the situation and the systemic failures that brought you to this point. He put his glasses back on, looking at each of them before continuing. I propose the following. You sign the paperwork today to enroll Gabriel in the program. Tomorrow morning, a discreet ambulance will transport him to our unit. No one needs to know the circumstances that preceded this admission. The official records will simply state that he was being treated at home under medical supervision and is now being transferred for specialized treatment. The relief on the couple's faces was palpable, but Irene noticed Dr. Richards wasn't finished. There is one condition. However, he added, his tone becoming sterner, if at any point I find that you are not being completely honest with me about Gabriel's history, or if you interfere with the proposed treatment, I will be forced to reconsider my position and take the appropriate legal action. Are we understood? Perfectly, Arthur replied, extending his hand. You have our word, Doctor. While the couple filled out the forms under the doctor's guidance, Irene excused herself and went back up to the attic. She found Gabriel still sitting in the same position, looking at the window now darkened by night. She sat beside him, not too close as to intimidate him, but near enough for him to hear her voice. Hi, Gabriel. I have some news for you. Tomorrow you're going to a new place. A place where people who understand what you're going through will try to really help. She paused, watching him closely for any reaction. There was no visible one. I'm nervous for you, she continued honestly. Change can be scary, but sometimes it's necessary to find new paths. She then remembered the guitar mentioned earlier. Your parents said you liked the Smiths. Me too. There is a light that never goes out was my favorite when I was your age. What was yours? To her surprise, Gabriel turned his head slightly in her direction. He didn't respond verbally, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a momentary connection. You know what? Irene smiled, encouraged. I'll bring my phone tomorrow with all their songs. We can listen together before you leave. What do you think? Again, no verbal reply, but something soft and almost imperceptible relaxed in Gabriel's expression. It wasn't exactly a smile, but perhaps the prelude to one, like the first ray of sun after a long storm. The next morning was a flurry of activity at the mansion. Marianne packed clothes for Gabriel, while Arthur organized medical documents into a folder. Irene had arrived especially early, bringing her old phone loaded with songs by the Smiths. As promised, Dr. Richards appeared at 8 a.m., accompanied by a kind-faced nurse named Regina and 2 assistants with a special gurney. He went up alone first to assess Gabriel and administer a light sedative to ease the transport. It's for your comfort, Irene heard the doctor explain to Gabriel in a respectful tone. Not to control you, just to make the journey less stressful. When the assistants finally came up with the gurney, Irene asked for a few minutes alone with Gabriel. She sat beside him as he showed the first signs of drowsiness from the medication and placed an earbud in his ear. As promised, she said, playing the song Losing My Religion by REM, another band she thought he might like. She didn't know his favorite, so she chose one of the most accessible. She watched Gabriel's face intently as the music played. At first there was no reaction. Then, almost imperceptibly, his fingers began to move, tapping to the rhythm. His lips trembled slightly, as if trying to follow the lyrics. When the song ended, Irene saw something she would never forget, a single tear silently streaming down Gabriel's pale face. It was the first display of emotion she had witnessed from him. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, gently holding his hand. "I'll come visit you, I promise." The transfer process went surprisingly smoothly. The assistants were skilled and respectful, treating Gabriel with dignity. Dr. Richards personally supervised every step, from removing the restraints to settling him in the ambulance. Marianne cried silently, holding her husband's hand, as they watched the ambulance drive away with their son. It wasn't a farewell. They could visit Gabriel the very next day, but it symbolized the end of a painful chapter and the beginning of an unknown journey. "And now?" Irene asked as the ambulance disappeared around the corner. "Now," Arthur replied, his voice choked with emotion, "we try to rebuild. Our family, our lives, our hope." The following days were ones of adjustment and transformation. Marianne and Arthur established a new routine, visiting Gabriel daily at the hospital. The first visits were difficult. He remained distant, sedated by the new medications, rarely responding to attempts at communication. Irene continued working at the mansion, now with different tasks. The attic was completely renovated, transformed into a welcoming space that could eventually receive Gabriel when he was ready for outpatient care. The restraints were removed, replaced by ergonomic furniture and discreet safety features. 2 weeks after Gabriel's admission, Dr. Richards invited Irene for a chat at his office in the hospital. She was greeted by the same kind nurse who had assisted with the transfer. "The doctor is just finishing a meeting," Regina explained, leading her to a waiting area. "But he asked you to watch this while you wait." Through a glass window, Irene could see a large room where about 10 patients were participating in what looked like a music therapy session. Some played simple instruments, others just listened. A few moved gently to the rhythm. Among them, sitting slightly apart, was Gabriel. He wasn't playing an instrument or moving, but his eyes were focused, attentive, following the movements of the therapist leading the session. "He's been like this for 3 days, Regina commented, standing beside her. "He doesn't actively participate yet, but he's present in a way he wasn't when he arrived. Dr. Richards believes music is building bridges where words can't reach." Irene watched, fascinated at this small but significant progress. She remembered the single tear when she played the music for him, the almost unconscious movement of his fingers. Dr. Richards joined them minutes later, his ever-present leather briefcase in hand. "He's responding well to the medication adjustments," he explained as they walked to his office. The traditional antipsychotics were causing more harm than good in his case. "We're using a more selective approach, combined with non-pharmacological therapies." In his office, the doctor showed Irene functional MRI scans, pointing to specific areas of Gabriel's brain. "See these brighter regions? These are areas activated when he listens to music. It indicates that certain neural pathways remain intact and responsive." "Does that mean he's going to get better?" Irene asked, trying to decipher the complex images. Dr. Richards removed his glasses, a gesture she had noticed was common when he needed to be particularly honest. "Better is a relative concept when we talk about resistant schizophrenia. Gabriel will likely never be the teenager he was before the onset of his symptoms. The illness has already caused structural changes in his brain that can't be completely reversed." Seeing Irene's disheartened expression, he continued in a softer tone. "But that doesn't mean he can't have a good quality of life. Meaningful connections, moments of lucidity, and even happiness. Our goal isn't to cure. It's to provide him with tools to navigate his particular reality with less suffering." "And what about the restraints? Will he still need them?" "Eventually, no. We're working on alternative strategies for agitated episodes, controlled sensory spaces, de-escalation techniques, rescue medication in minimal doses. It takes time, but it's possible." Irene absorbed every word, amazed at the difference between this humanized approach and the previous experiences described by the Harringtons. Why are there so few places like this? Why do so many families go through what the Harringtons went through? Dr. Richards sighed deeply, leaning back in his chair. Irene's question touched on a point that clearly troubled him. It's a combination of factors: chronic underfunding of mental health, social stigma, a lack of specialized professionals, outdated approaches that persist. The list is long. He opened a drawer and took out a framed photograph. Handing it to Irene, it showed a smiling young man with features that vaguely resembled the doctor's own. My brother, John, diagnosed with schizophrenia at 19. I lost him to suicide at 23, after years of inadequate treatment and a society that saw him as a lost cause. Irene looked at the photograph with silent respect, now understanding the source of the compassion she saw in the doctor's eyes. It's because of him that I became a psychiatrist. It's because of him that I created this program, and for all the Johns and Gabriels who continue to be abandoned by a system that should protect them. He put the photograph away carefully, as one would a treasure. To answer your question, places like this are rare because they require more than just financial resources. They require a fundamental shift in how we view mental illness and those who suffer from it. That conversation deeply affected Irene. Leaving the hospital that day, she felt transformed, as if she had received not just information, but a mission. In the following weeks, she established a new routine. She continued to work at the Harrington mansion during the day, but 3 times a week after her shift, she would go to the medical center to visit Gabriel. With Dr. Richards's approval and the consent of Marianne and Arthur, she participated as a volunteer in the music therapy sessions. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Gabriel began to show signs of progress. In the 3rd week, he accepted a tambourine offered by the therapist and produced a few hesitant rhythms. In the 4th week, when Irene quietly hummed a song by the Smiths, he accompanied her with soft, precise beats. It's as if the music is building a bridge over the abyss he's trapped in, Marianne commented after observing one of these sessions. Her eyes, once constantly tearful, now shone with a cautious hope. The relationship between Irene and the Harringtons also evolved. She was no longer just an employee. She had become an ally, a confidant, an essential part of the support system forming around Gabriel. They would have dinner together after hospital visits, exchange observations, and celebrate small victories. A month and a half after the treatment began, Dr. Richards announced that Gabriel was ready for the next phase, the semi-intensive regimen, where he would spend the day at the treatment center but sleep at home. "We've prepared everything," Arthur said, showing Irene the changes made to Gabriel's old room on the 2nd floor. The space had been completely redesigned according to Dr. Richards's guidelines: soft lighting, neutral colors, controlled sensory stimuli, and a high-quality sound system for home music therapy sessions. "We're going to need you more than ever," Marianne admitted. "Gabriel seems to respond to you differently." "There's a connection there I can't explain." Irene nodded, touched by their trust but also concerned about her own family situation. Zelda, though more stable thanks to the treatment she could now afford, still needed constant care. "I need to think about how to balance everything," she answered honestly. "My mother—" "Bring her," Marianne interrupted impulsively. "We have 3 empty guest rooms. You and your mother can have the ground floor suite. It would be easier for you, and we'd have your constant presence to help with Gabriel's transition." The offer took Irene by surprise. "I don't know if that would be appropriate. I'm your employee, after all." Arthur, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "Irene, you stopped being just our employee the moment you chose to help our son instead of reporting us. What we're offering isn't charity. It's a practical solution for a situation where we all need support." After much consideration and consulting with Zelda, Irene accepted the proposal. The adjustment wasn't easy. Her mother initially felt out of place in the luxurious mansion, worried about being a bother or an inconvenience. But Marianne's persistent kindness and Arthur's respect gradually made her feel welcome. It was Zelda, surprisingly, who first got a spontaneous verbal response from Gabriel 2 weeks after he returned home. During dinner, the old woman casually mentioned an old recipe for a spice cake she used to make when Irene was a child. "My grandmother made that," Gabriel said suddenly, his voice hoarse from disuse. With cream cheese frosting. The silence that followed was almost sacred. No one dared to comment, fearing they might break the spell. But that night, after Gabriel had retired, there were tears of quiet joy and silent hugs in the kitchen. Affective memory, Dr. Richards explained, when told about the episode. Smells, tastes, music. They are emotional anchors that can reach parts of the mind that seem inaccessible. That's why we insist so much on music therapy, and will now introduce culinary therapy. The months passed, marking a year since Irene had first walked through the gates of the mansion in Scarsdale. The transformation in everyone involved was remarkable. Gabriel, though still struggling with his condition, now had good days and bad days instead of just bad days and terrible ones. On good days, he could hold simple conversations, participate in structured activities, even smile occasionally. On bad days, he would withdraw, but no longer so deeply or frighteningly. The restraints became a distant memory, replaced by self-regulation techniques he was slowly learning to apply with help. Marianne and Arthur, free from their self-imposed isolation and constant fear, reconnected with friends, resumed professional projects, and rediscovered small joys. The weight of guilt and shame gradually lessened, replaced by a resilient determination to face each challenge as a family. Zelda, benefiting from continuous treatment and the peaceful environment, regained her strength. Her wisdom and stories became a source of comfort, not only for Irene but for everyone in the house, including Gabriel in his more lucid moments. And Irene had found a purpose she never imagined for herself. Inspired by her experience with Gabriel, she started a nursing technician program, with plans to specialize in mental health. On Saturday mornings, she volunteered for a project created by Dr. Richards that brought music and art therapy to public psychiatric institutions. It was during one of these volunteer mornings that Irene met Jasmine, a dedicated social worker who coordinated a support group for families dealing with severe mental disorders. Every family that finds a viable path ends up becoming a beacon for others, still lost in the dark, Jasmine commented as they watched patients participate in a painting activity. The problem is that most suffer in isolation, unaware that alternatives exist. Those words planted a seed in Irene's mind. That night, during dinner at the mansion, she shared an idea she had been quietly cultivating. What if we use the resources and experience we have here to help other families in similar situations? Arthur frowned, intrigued. How exactly? I was thinking of creating a foundation, a center that offers information, resources, support groups, legal guidance, a place that could serve as a bridge between desperate families and proper treatments, like Dr. Richards's program. A bridge, Marianne murmured, a gleam in her eye. Like you were for us. The idea took shape in the following weeks. Arthur, with his business expertise, structured a sustainable financial plan. Marianne, reactivating contacts from her time as a corporate lawyer, handled the legal aspects. Dr. Richards offered technical guidance and connections to the academic and hospital network. The Bridge Foundation, as it was named, started modestly in a room provided by the medical center. Initially, it only offered weekly meetings for families and distributed informational materials. But the demand soon exceeded all expectations. We need a bigger space, Irene noted, 3 months after activities began. And more volunteers. It was Arthur who proposed the solution. We have that property in Greenwich, my parents' old house. It's been closed up for years. With a few renovations, it could be perfect. The old mansion in Greenwich, smaller than the one in Scarsdale but still spacious and well located, became the official center for the Bridge Foundation. Large rooms were converted into meeting halls, offices for volunteer counseling, and spaces for therapeutic workshops. The revitalized garden became a peaceful retreat for patients and families. Irene, initially reluctant to accept a leadership position, ended up taking on the operational coordination of the foundation, applying in practice the knowledge she was gaining in her technical course and from her daily life with Gabriel. I never imagined that terrible discovery in the attic would lead me to this, she commented to Zelda as they watched the activity at the center on a particularly busy Saturday. Life has its ironies. Dear, the old woman replied with the wisdom of her years, sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the scariest paper. Gabriel, who rarely visited the foundation due to his sensitivity to highly stimulating environments, made a special appearance that day. It was an important occasion, the launch of a guidebook for families compiled by Marianne from experiences collected in the support groups. With the help of noise-cancelling headphones, one of the many adaptations that were now part of his life, Gabriel managed to stay for the entire ceremony. Seated between his parents, occasionally tapping a small percussion instrument he always carried as a sensory anchor, he seemed simultaneously present and distant, connected and in his own world. At one point, when Irene went up to the small stage to speak about the foundation's work, her eyes met Gabriel's in the audience. He didn't smile. Smiles were still rare, but he made a small movement with his instrument, a rhythm she immediately recognized as the intro to "There Is a Light That Never Goes Out," the first song they had shared. That small gesture, imperceptible to most, contained a whole history of pain, hope, connection, and new beginnings. It was the silent confirmation that, despite all the challenges that remained, the path they had chosen was the right one. At the end of her speech, Irene added something unplanned. "There's a song that says it takes love to be able to pulse. It takes peace to be able to smile. It takes rain to be able to bloom. I believe it also takes courage to confront the darkness, compassion to see beyond appearances, and community to turn despair into hope." This foundation was born from those three elements, and I hope it continues to cultivate them for many years to come. That night, after an emotionally intense day, Gabriel had one of his rare moments of deep connection. During dinner, he looked directly at Irene and asked, his voice clear, "Why did you stay?" "That day, you could have left." The question took everyone by surprise. It was the longest, most complex sentence he had formed in months, and it showed an awareness of the situation that many thought was beyond his current capacity. Irene thought carefully before answering, knowing that honesty was essential. "I stayed because I saw beyond what it seemed to be. I saw parents who loved desperately, even when they didn't know how to help. I saw a young man lost inside his own mind, needing understanding, not judgment. And maybe I also saw in you a little of my Uncle Silas, who never got the chance that you're getting now." Gabriel nodded slowly, as if processing every word. Then he turned his attention back to his plate. The window of connection temporarily closed. But something had changed. A seed of understanding had been planted, a small step on the long journey of reconnecting with the world and himself. Later, alone in her room, Irene reflected on Gabriel's question. The real answer was perhaps more complex than she had admitted. She had also stayed for herself, because facing that impossible situation had transformed her, given her purpose, allowed her to grow beyond the limits she thought she had. A text message interrupted her thoughts. It was from Dr. Richards. Gabriel's latest test results are in. Positive response to the new protocol. Small but significant improvements in neural connectivity. We're still on the right path. Thank you for your part in all this. 2 years had passed since the discovery in the attic. Life had settled into new rhythms, new patterns, new possibilities. The Bridge Foundation had flourished beyond the most optimistic expectations. What began as a small project, born from the personal experience of the Harringtons and Irene, had become a benchmark for supporting families dealing with severe mental disorders. Partnerships with universities, hospitals, and even government agencies expanded its reach beyond New York City, with new chapters starting to emerge in other cities. Irene, now a certified nursing technician and pursuing a degree in nursing with a specialization in mental health, divided her time between her studies, coordinating the foundation and caring for Zelda, whose health had stabilized thanks to continuous treatment. Gabriel, at 19, lived what Dr. Richards called a dynamic equilibrium, not a complete cure, which might never come, but an adaptation that allowed for moments of connection, purpose, and even joy, interspersed with periods of challenge that were now managed with proper tools and support. Music therapy remained his primary anchor. With time and a great deal of patience, Gabriel had taken up the guitar again, adapting his technique to his new limitations. He didn't play with his former dexterity, but he had found his own style, minimalist, occasionally dissonant, and profoundly expressive. On a sunny Saturday morning, the mansion in Scarsdale was preparing for a special event. The Bridge Foundation had organized a different kind of gathering, not focused on clinical discussions or support groups, but a cultural celebration, an afternoon of music and art featuring patients and their families. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Arthur asked his son gently as he helped him tune his guitar on the porch. "No one will expect you to perform if you don't feel comfortable." Gabriel, his hair now longer, and his face having regained some of its lost vitality, pondered the question with the seriousness that characterized his interactions. "I want to try," he replied simply. "Dr. Richards says controlled challenges are important." Arthur nodded, holding back his emotion. These small demonstrations of determination, so rare in the darkest moments of the illness, were now treasures he carefully collected in his memory. In the kitchen, Marianne and Irene prepared snacks for the guests. While Zelda supervised the making of brownies, her special recipe had become legendary at foundation events. "Gabriel seems nervous," Marianne commented, peering through the kitchen window. "Maybe we should suggest he just watch this time." "Let him try," Irene answered, delicately arranging the appetizers on a platter. "You always say that before he got sick he loved playing for an audience. Maybe that part of him is still there waiting for a chance." The mansion's garden had been transformed into a small natural amphitheater. Chairs arranged in a semicircle faced a space under a large tree, decorated with lights and musical instruments. Gradually, the guests began to arrive, families connected to the foundation, professional volunteers, a few journalists interested in their work. Dr. Richards arrived with Regina, the nurse who now coordinated the training of new professionals in the hospital's program. He brought encouraging news. "The Department of Health has approved the expansion of the program to 5 new centers in the state," he announced, accepting a glass of juice from Irene. "They'll use our protocol as a model. It's a huge victory for the approach we advocate." The afternoon progressed with various performances, a choir of family members, a percussion group from the Foundation's day center, readings of poems written during therapy workshops. The atmosphere was one of restrained celebration, respectful of individual limitations, but also affirming of possibilities. When it was time for Gabriel's performance, an expectant silence fell over the garden. Many of those present knew his story, not the most delicate details the family kept private, but enough to understand the magnitude of the moment. Gabriel sat on the stool prepared under the tree, adjusted the special headphones that filtered out excessive noise, and looked at the small audience. His gaze, once so empty, now revealed a complexity of emotions: nervousness, determination, a touch of fear. Irene, sitting in the front row next to Zelda, gave him an encouraging smile. Marianne and Arthur, a few seats away, held each other's hands tightly, preparing for any outcome, a triumph, a failure, or something in between. With slightly trembling fingers, Gabriel began to strum the guitar. The first chords were hesitant, imprecise. There was a tense moment when it seemed he might give up, overwhelmed by the attention and expectation. It was then that Irene did something unexpected. She began to sing softly, just loud enough for Gabriel to hear. The melody of "There Is a Light That Never Goes Out," that first musical connection they had shared years ago. The effect was almost immediate. Gabriel's fingers found the rhythm accompanying her, gaining confidence with each measure. Gradually his voice joined Irene's, hoarse, unaccustomed, but strangely moving in its fragility. He didn't sing all the words, just fragments that emerged from his musical memory, which was better preserved than other forms of recollection. When the song ended, there was a moment of reverent silence, followed by warm but restrained applause, respectful of Gabriel's acoustic sensitivity. He didn't smile openly. His smiles were still rare and subtle, but there was a light in his eyes that communicated more than any facial expression could. Encouraged by his success, Gabriel surprised everyone by starting another song without warning. It was an original composition, something no one knew he had created during his music therapy sessions. A simple, repetitive, hypnotic piece, like a window into the inner experience of his mind. When he finally finished and stood up to return to his seat, Dr. Richards gave him a standing ovation, followed by everyone present. They weren't just applauding the musical performance, which was technically imperfect, but the extraordinary journey it represented, from a dark attic to the light of the garden, from isolation to reconnection, however partial and fragile it still was. Later, When most of the guests had left, a small group remained on the porch. Irene, Zelda, the Harringtons, Dr. Richards, and Gabriel, who looked tired but strangely satisfied, a feeling he rarely allowed himself to show. "There's something I've been wanting to ask," Marianne said, breaking a comfortable silence. "Irene, what did you really think that first day, when you opened the attic door and saw Gabriel?" The direct question caught Irene off guard. Explicit references to that initial moment were rare, as if everyone preferred to focus on the path taken since. "Honestly, I felt terror," she replied, opting for the complete truth. "Not because of what I saw, but because of what I imagined. My mind created terrible stories, kidnapping, abuse, things like that." Gabriel, who had seemed distant from the conversation, focused on a bird that had landed on the porch railing, surprisingly interjected. "I was scared too," he said, his voice clear in one of those rare moments of deep connection. "Not of you, of my mind. The voices." It was the first time Gabriel had spoken so directly about his internal experience from that time. Everyone was momentarily speechless, respecting the weight of the revelation. "Son," Arthur began hesitantly, "do you blame us for what we did?" Gabriel turned slowly to his father, his eyes meeting his with a lucidity that wasn't always present. "You did what you could," he replied, each word carefully chosen. "Like me, like all of us." The simplicity and depth of that absolution brought tears to Marianne's and Arthur's eyes. It was a forgiveness they perhaps didn't fully deserve, but one they accepted as a precious gift. "The system failed you long before you failed Gabriel," Dr. Richards added softly. "That's why the work we do at the Foundation is so important, so that other families don't reach that point of desperation." Irene watched the interaction with a mixture of emotions. She had come a long way since that first terrifying discovery, from a cleaner worried only about supporting her mother to the coordinator of a foundation, a nursing student, an integral part of a story of transformation and healing. "Do you know what else I thought that day?" she said, returning to Marianne's original question. "After the initial shock looking at Gabriel, I thought, there's more to this. I didn't know what, but I felt the story was more complex than it seemed at first glance." "And you were right," commented Zelda, who had only been listening until then. "There's usually more to situations that seem simple to judge. It takes courage to look for that something more. Better not be content with the first impression." As night fell on the garden and the first stars began to dot the New York sky, the conversation flowed peacefully, interspersed with moments of comfortable silence. Gabriel eventually retired to his room, following the routine that helped maintain his stability, but not before briefly touching Irene's arm in a rare gesture of physical affection. "Thank you," he murmured almost inaudibly, "for looking for the something more." Those simple words encapsulated the entire journey, from fear to understanding, from judgment to compassion, from isolation to community. Months later, at a ceremony in the auditorium of Columbia University's medical school, the Bridge Foundation would receive an award recognizing its innovative work in supporting families dealing with severe mental disorders. On stage, representing the organization, would be Irene, Marianne, and, to the surprise and emotion of many, Gabriel, not as a success story, but as an integral part of the story, a protagonist in his own narrative of recovery. The news report covering the event highlighted a particularly moving moment. Gabriel, though visibly nervous about the exposure, offering a few words at the microphone. "There are many kinds of prisons," he said, his voice clear though hesitant. "Some have physical walls. Others exist only in our minds. Some we never fully escape, but all of them can become less lonely when we find people willing to enter them with us, even if only for a few moments." The journalist who reported these words didn't know the full context behind them, the story of the attic, the restraints, the desperation of a family abandoned by the system. She didn't need to. The message transcended the specific circumstances, touching on a universal truth about compassion, connection, and the complexity of the human experience. In the audience at that event, Zelda, now using a cane but with her eyes as lively as ever, held her daughter's hand with pride. Beside her, Dr. Richards watched with professional satisfaction the result of years of hard work, not just with Gabriel, but with the entire system that was gradually being transformed. And somewhere in the universe, perhaps the spirit of Uncle Silas finally found peace, seeing that his story of suffering had in some way contributed to changing the trajectory of other lives. As for Irene, seated between her biological family and her chosen family, she felt a fulfillment she had never imagined possible. Her life had expanded in unexpected ways from that moment of terror in the attic. She had learned that the deepest truths are rarely evident at first glance, that quick judgment often obscures the complexity of human situations, and that sometimes the most courageous act is not to report or condemn, but to try to understand. Gabriel would continue to face challenges for the rest of his life. Resistant schizophrenia had not magically disappeared, nor were all his days filled with clarity and connection. There would be relapses, moments of darkness, battles that would seem impossible to win, but he would never again face those moments in the absolute solitude of a dark attic, trapped as much by physical restraints as by the social isolation that stigma imposes. And for Irene, that was perhaps the greatest victory of all, not a miraculous cure, but the transformation of a solitary prison into a shared journey, of a devastating truth into an opportunity for growth and connection. On a quiet evening, months after the award ceremony, Irene found Gabriel in the mansion's garden, looking at the stars while gently strumming his guitar. She sat silently beside him, respecting the space he still often needed. After a few minutes of contemplative music, Gabriel spoke without taking his eyes off the sky. "Sometimes, when I'm playing, the voices get quiet, as if they're listening too." It was one of the rare occasions he spoke directly about the auditory hallucinations that still accompanied him, though with less intensity thanks to his treatment. "I'm glad you found that quiet," Irene replied, understanding the weight of the confidence. Gabriel nodded, continuing to strum the instrument. "We all need a break. Did you find yours too?" The question surprised Irene with its perceptiveness. Gabriel, in his moments of clarity, showed a surprising understanding of the people around him. "I did," she confirmed, smiling softly. "In fact, I found more than a break. I found a path." The notes from the guitar floated in the night air, creating an improvised melody that seemed to capture their entire journey. The shadows and the light, the despair and the hope, the prison and the freedom. It wasn't a perfect melody, nor completely harmonious. It had dissonances, abrupt pauses, moments of near chaos, but it also had beauty, authenticity, and above all, continuity, like the life now unfolding before them, imperfect but valuable, challenging but rich with meaning. And so, under the same stars that had witnessed so many moments of their shared history, a cleaner who had become so much more and a young man who was gradually reclaiming his humanity beyond his diagnosis. Each found their own form of peace, not absolute or permanent, but real, present, and above all possible. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Irene and Gabriel has touched your hearts. To enjoy more narratives that explore the complexities of the human soul, we have prepared a special playlist with equally moving stories. Find it by clicking the link on your left. If this journey of compassion and transformation resonated with you, be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Every day we bring you original stories that invite us to look beyond appearances and find the humanity in unexpected situations. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective on this narrative might illuminate aspects that others have missed. Until our next meeting, where new stories await to awaken deep emotions and reflections.